we see this in the context of family, right? Of embracing, at the end, Tammy's gay son, of forging in the opening sequence with AJ reading his letter to his late father, forging a relationship with the dead, telling the dead his truth, but also forging a relationship with his stepmother and carrying on with the family that he is making, right, in that moment out of this bond of empathy. It's also crying as the capacity to be a man. It's very much connected to the images of masculinity, where it's not sort of pushed away, right, or hidden. As a sign of masculinity, it's celebrating the capacity to feel deeply, to cry in front of other men, to embrace other men, right, to hold another man while he cries, and not to be threatened by what that means about who we are. It's about the capacity to love the self, to embrace who you are, to be proud of who you are, right? To have a kind of good moment of affirmation and to say, it's good to care for myself, it's good to find ways to love myself rather than hate myself. It's about personal triumph, a way of celebrating something that you thought you couldn't do. So the guy who proposes to his girlfriend in front of all those people is overcoming social anxiety, is overcoming the barrier of doing something publicly and managing to do this monumental thing in front of all these people, and that's celebrated. It's a celebration of new embodiment in the case of the trans operation that we see. Very intimate moment, usually hidden, certainly from cameras, but seeing what it means to have the, what they call an inspiration, right? The inspiring conviction to go through an extreme operation to change your body to conform to your own truth. And finally, there's this tagline that Tammy says at the end, that it's about being in some relationship. It's about building relationships and telling the truth while you're doing that, right? So she says, I love God, I'm a believer, but I love my son. And I've got to say that, or otherwise I'm a hypocrite, right? So there's this sort of affirmation of telling the truth and building relationships through it. So for me, sort of I'll just sort of summarize some of the implications and then open it up. When do we end? We still have time. When do we go to? Oh, I can keep talking. All right. So let me just say what some of the conclusions are that we might want to think about in taking up some of these issues of crying in this direction. So a lot of the theories of film spectatorship presume that what we're doing as spectators is that we're identifying with what's on screen, that we're seeing some sort of correspondence or mimicry between the action on screen and who we are. And I want to propose that this helps us think toward a different way of conceiving spectatorship and spectator relations that's about interrelation and intersubjective trafficking rather than simply identification. So the body of the spectator is not simply passive in response to this activity. We're somehow being asked to and facilitated in the act of putting ourselves in the places of others. Right? Not just saying, oh yeah, I get it, but actually being invited into a relation with what we're seeing. And that's different, it's differently transformative, and it's interesting to me that in the case of Queer Eye, that it's gayness that is doing that. And that's a surprising phenomenon, even in 2019, right? That there would be such a value to what gay men can do, right, in engendering a kind of relationality and intersubjective affirmation. And I think that that's why this is so popular, and it's so popular for the reason of crying, right? It's that we're being invited into something that feels different, it feels possible, right? It feels exciting, but it also feels different from what's happened in the past on television. So I think I could say lots more about that, but I'd love to hear some of your thoughts and questions, and then I can sort of take off in whatever direction is of most interest to you, and you can facilitate that or whatever you'd like. But I had planned to talk for about an hour, and I've gone over that.
I guess I would like to raise the first question.
Yeah.
In a way, it seems to me that this is a response to the element, for example, because element thesis is, to place gay, especially gay male, right, in a position of anti-relationality in queer theory, right? Whereas in your formulation, and this is really something new, right? Now we have the figure of a gay male that enables relationality, right? That enables subjective experiences through affective exchange, right? But the question is, so what's that difference? Of course, I know, I kind of feel that it's different. Right? But what exactly is different in this place as opposed to, for example, the opera show, where you also have, you really have women crying together about one's realization of herself, right? And in also very melodramatic ways. So what's the difference?
Yeah, good. Okay, so first, so Lee Edelman is a Lacanian psychoanalytic thinker, critic, theorist, whose book No Future became an incredibly important articulation of what people have come to call the antisocial thesis, meaning that in Edelman's psychoanalytic register, that gayness is formulated as the denial of futurity, as the denial of a kind of normative organization of sociality in order to reproduce and create children and the future. Right? And he says, no future. This is a way of refusing all of the structures of sociality that are constraining, normative, hierarchical, patriarchal, right? That whole mode of social organization has to be thrown out, and instead, right, this sort of antisocial, no future idealization. Now, the important thing I think about Edelman is that he doesn't mean this literally. And he doesn't mean it on the register of who we are in relation to one another. He means it psychoanalytically, right? Meaning it's about structures of fantasy, desire, and symbolic organization, not about who we are as human beings, right? So I think he's been misrecognized as being somebody who just hates kids or who doesn't believe in, being together in the world or whatever, and that's not the case, right? He's working at a theoretical conception that is resolutely Lacanian, right? So put that aside. I'm not a Lacanian. I'm not so interested in psychoanalysis. I am interested in fantasy. I am interested in desire. But I'm not so interested in the regimented reading of the symbolic that Edelman adopts wholesale. And there's an interesting struggle, actually, in the book that he wrote with Lauren Berlant called Sex or the Unbearable, where you see Lauren Berlant, who's much more interested in what we're talking about today, which is sentiment, sentimentality, right? You see Lauren Berlant and Lee Edelman sort of struggling over different registers of that conversation with regard to queerness. So that would be an interesting sort of way to take Edelman's argument and test it against different registers, because Lauren is not so interested in the rigidly psychoanalytic, although she is interested in psychoanalysis. Okay, so what I would say about Edelman, and it's very helpful of you to point this out, that there's this resonance, is that he's not interested in the intersubjective, but he's not theorizing it psychoanalytically. Okay, so what I'm trying to do is suggest that we start to figure out ways of talking about intersubjectivity and relationality in the different corners of where we do theory. And where I do theory is in relation to cinema and media. There are different ways of talking about relationality in psychoanalysis, for example. Right? There is a school of relational psychoanalysis. And there are people who are struggling within that framework to think about relationality in different terms. But I'm responding very directly to a tradition of cinema and media spectator theory that insists upon identification as the only paradigm. And that happens up until the 1990s. I would say Linda Williams' article on body genres that we were talking about here. She's a UC Berkeley professor who wrote an important article that I think is called Gender, Genre, and Excess in the early 1990s to try and think through some of these questions. And she rehearses a lot of the film theory that takes identification as its paradigm, and she sort of says, we need something else, but she doesn't propose what that would be. Right? And I'm trying to think through what that would be.
That's funny, because when you read that article last week.
There you go. Okay, did you really?
Yes.
Okay. So that article is a starting point, but you know, at the end of it, she says, I don't know, maybe we should try something else, right? And so I'm inspired by that to try something else. Now, what's different about Oprah, right, or about sentimentality, is that it's not refracted through difference in the way that I think this is refracted through difference. And if I had more kind of time to give you a lot of queer eye and a lot of context, I would want to insist that what this is about is investigating racial difference in the American South through the prism of gayness. And that is crazy interesting. I mean, it is really unusual to be thinking about one of the biggest fault lines in Southern American culture, black-white difference, and mediating it through this kind of prism of queerness. So that when we see Tammy at the end there saying, I'm a believer, I love God, I'm here in an evangelical Christian church with black people, and I love my gay son, that is really, really unusual. Okay? And you see those ladies with their hats, you know, saying, you go girl, you say that truth, right? Like endorsing that awakening and position is very unusual with regard to American culture. And I think that that has made the new Queer Eye, the Atlantic Queer Eye, a much more political undertaking. Post-Trumpian, reconciliation-bound undertaking that really takes race as its central kind of issue. So when you see the guy the guy with the big huge beard and the glasses who's sitting outdoors at the table, and he starts crying, he says, you told me at the beginning, or I said you can't fix ugly, and you guys fixed ugly, and he starts weeping. Right? That's a guy who, in that episode, says right at the beginning, I've never met a gay person. I don't know if I'm gonna like you. I've never met you kind of people, and I don't know what this is gonna be like. And they say, whoa, okay, well, let's try it. And the implication is also that he's a racist white guy, right? That he hasn't engaged with people who are different from him. And he comes to a point where he's now weeping with Tam, the South Asian guy, right? Saying to him, you're a good man. You're a good man, right? So there's this I would say it's a very different structure of feeling, to use a Raymond Williams term, and you're maybe teaching that. But there's a different structure of feeling than simple affirmation of the sentimentality style, with different political valences, but still a lot of self-love for that sort. Thank you for that. Thanks, help me figure that out.
Anyone who has questions to ask Professor Villarejo? 我觉得有问题，就是你对刚刚看的影片。
In the introduction to this talk,
Yeah.
this phrase is the political emotions. So I just want to ask you to clarify more, maybe from this Queer Eye series,
Yes.
these political emotions, because we saw emotions.
Yes.
So what is the political in there?
Yeah, good. That's a very good question. What is political? How do you conjoin
Yes, it's
the idea of the two together, right? So there's a body of work by the person I was just talking about, Lauren Berlant. You're going to read, maybe? Not for this class, okay. So Lauren Berlant and a group, a kind of collective of thinkers call themselves the Collective of Political Emotions. And I think that there are two main ideas in that phrase. One is that our feelings aren't entirely separate from the land of politics, and that politics is played out at the level of our feelings, right? So that those aren't separate things. So your example, we'll go back to Triumph of the Will, right, is a political appeal to the body, a political fashioning of the body into the body politic, right? Into a larger entity of the nation, of the party, and that it's not only Nazi or fascist politics that speaks to our bodies and our feelings, but that politics are played out at the level of emotion. So that's one thesis. And the other thesis might be something like structures of feeling, ways of being oriented toward the world, including our emotional orientation toward the world, can be political. So that empathy across difference can have political value, right? It's not just feeling, but it's feeling that can transform the way we see the world, which is what politics encapsulates, right? And this is a long-held thesis of cultural studies, right? As a field, as an area, that when we inquire into cultural objects or seemingly minor, right, things like a book or a television program or a movie, that we're able to say things about the way that the world works and the way that we are oriented toward the world by understanding how culture works. So that politics and emotions, or bodies, feelings, culture, art, politics are all interconnected. So that might be one of the ways we could understand that phrase, political emotions. Does that answer your question?
Any more questions? He's trying to phone you.
That's good. No, it's not in a hurry.
刚刚我们看的这些例子啊，因为它有一些 setting 可能同学们比较不是那么清楚，它是在美国南方，所以你可以看到其中有一个那个穿就是在户外的那个男生，他是比较是像成绩型的白人，然后还有里面有一段他在讲那个弄牙齿、矫正牙齿那一段。矫正牙齿在美国很贵，所以其实不是一般人可以负担的所以你会在，有时候你会在像这样子的电视里看到说，通常是比较穷的非裔美国人，基本上因为一辈子都没有那个经济能力可以去矫正牙齿，所以才会有刚刚那个画面，矫正完还非常高兴，因为是他一辈子碰到的事情。那你的外表经常会影响你，比如说你可不可以找到工作，所以它其实是个 class marker， 对，所以它这些影片它有很多关于美国的种族跟阶级的差异，那这也是刚刚刘老师在说的东西，比如说它里面有一个那个最后是一个非裔美国人的教会，通常在南方。尤其是美国的Villarejo-Queer，如果是酷儿的话，那其实是一个很艰难的环境所以你可以看到这些不同的议题在这些短片里面就显现出来，是一个比较特别的地方。还是说各位想再看一次？刚刚有看到吗？那第一段那个事实上是一个非裔美国的男人，对啊，那跟他死去的爸爸说因为他在爸爸过世前，他一直没有办法，尤其对非裔美国的男人来说，要承认或是要去宣称说自己是男同志，其实是很难的一件事情。对，那就跟黑人的 masculinity 在美国的社会被定义有关系。在主流的美国媒体，通常非裔男人会被定义成 hyper masculine，对，他会是 masculine，所以要一个非裔美国男人去承认说他是一个对男人有欲望的男人，这是很难的，因为他同时又意味着什么？他的作为少数群体的 masculinity 可能会diminished，所以它是一个很艰难的情况。所以第一个讲的这个东西，所以这一个非裔美国男人 甚至在他父亲生前，他完全没有办法讲这件事，是在他死后，讲一封信，透过一封念那封信，来讲，对，所以还有各种不同的人员。张琪想好吗？
You just mean that body response is political and intersubjective. But for me, it's also quite dangerous because at that moment, I think I lost control
Yeah.
of my own body.
Yeah.
So, because I know that melodrama is interpolating me, sometimes I will intentionally reject the body response.
Yes.
I will tell myself it's fake. They just want to make me cry.
Yes.
And I know there is no interaction between me and the melodrama. It's just unidirectional, not bidirectional.
Great point. So when I was talking about some of the questions that crying might help us to ask, one of them is that relationship between activity and passivity. Right? So we can reject what texts ask us to do all the time. I'm not going to cry, right? I'm not going to be vulnerable. It is dangerous, right? And we can say, no, 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 no. I'm not going to go to a horror film. I don't like that stuff. Ugh. Right? No, 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 no. I don't want to be in that position, right? And there are many people, you know, if something comes on the screen that's scary, oh, right? I don't want to let myself, right, be taken that way, right? So, of course, there are holes between activity and passivity, right? And sometimes what happens when you reject what a text is asking you to do, you can become aggressive, right? You can say, I hate you. I'm not doing that. I hate that lady, right? You can take your aggression, your vulnerability, and turn it into aggression, right? Control the world that way, right? So of course, it's not something that we entirely control. Right? Sometimes something will come get you anyway, even if you are trying not to be taken in, trying not to be vulnerable. I hate this movie, I don't care, right? But something gets you anyway, right? So I think that relationship between activity and passivity, vulnerability and control, that's at the heart of spectatorship, at the heart of it, right? So it's very much a question about when do we let ourselves be taken in, and what is the result of that? And that's something that Williams and a whole tradition of people who think about spectatorship are really interested in, right? Particularly along gendered lines, right, where a lot of film theory from the 1970s was following Laura Mulvey's idea of the male gaze, that is about films that are structured in order to create passive women, images of women who are passive, and active men who control the narrative, who are the protagonists and so on, and set up a dynamic between active man, passive woman that film theory has been struggling to undo, to rethink for 40 years.